Thank you very much, Sherry. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are. Thank you very much for joining the Rosenberg Forum's third webinar of the, I would say, based on academic year. And we are delighted that you are able to join us. This particular forum, and it's, as the title reveals, deals with the international transboundary water issue, one of the most important river basins in the world. And I'm delighted that we have an excellent group of speakers and moderators that will manage the next hour and a half plus webinar. At this point, I'd like to ask my colleague, the Vice President of the University of California for Agriculture and Natural Resources, Dr. Glenda Humiston, to greet you.
Thank you, Sarush, and welcome to all of our participants. We're really thrilled to have you here with us today. As Sarush mentioned, I serve as Vice President for Agriculture and Natural Resources for the University of California System. And we are honored to host the Rosenberg International Forum on Water Policy. The forum was created in 1996 with an endowment from the Bank of America to us to honor the retiring bank president, Richard Rosenberg. Normally, the forum is held every other year in different locations around the world, where we host 50 water scholars and senior water managers to participate in interactive discussions about the science of water management and different experiences in water management around the globe. Unfortunately, during this challenging time of COVID-19, when in-person interactions are not possible, the Rosenberg Forum remains committed to our mission of reducing conflict and promoting cooperation in the management of water resources. Given the need to delay our 11th biennial Rosenberg Forum on Water Policy, which was originally planned to be held this past November 2020 in partnership with Northwest Ag and Forestry University, Yangling in China, the Rosenberg Advisory Committee is excited to offer this series of virtual engagement and learning opportunities. So again, welcome for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy our offering on Flashpoints and Water Conflicts, the case of the Nile River. Sarush, back to you.
Thank you very much, Glenda. At this point, I invite all members of our advisory board to introduce themselves. So we will go according to the listing that is provided on the Zoom.
Thank you, Sarush. Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Christina Babbitt. I manage our California Groundwater Program at Environmental Defense Fund, which is an international environmental nonprofit. Good to see everyone.
So good morning and afternoon. My name is Lucia De Stefano. I am associate professor at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid in Spain, and also deputy director of the Water Observatory of the Basin Foundation, which is a think tank devoted to water policy.
Good day, everyone. My name is Ariel Dinar. I am with the School of Public Policy at the University of California, Riverside, and I work on issues related to water in California and abroad.
Good morning. My name is Qiyun Duan from Huahai University in Nanjing, China. And my area of research is surface hydrology and the impact of climate change on water resources.
Good morning, good afternoon. This is Alberto Garrido. I'm a professor of agriculture and natural resource economics of Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, Technical University of Madrid, and I'm also the director of the Water Observatory of the Basin Foundation, which is co-organizer of this series of seminars with the Rosenberg Forum. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Andrea Gerlach. I'm with the University of Arizona. I am a professor in the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment, and the Associate Director for the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, and my work is on water policy and governance. Welcome, happy you're with us today.
Hello, my name's Helen Ingram, and I'm a longtime participant in Rosenberg forums. I am an emerita professor at the University of California at Irvine, and I am also a professor emeritus of the University of Arizona, and I am with Andrea in beautiful, warm Tucson.
Hi, good morning, Ben Maddox. I am the newest member of the advisory committee. I actually started officially, I think, 3 days ago. So thank you very much for having me. I am a senior vice president in the Food, Ag, and Wine Executive for the Western region for Bank of America. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ayman Rabi. I am the Executive Director of Palestinian Hydrology Group, which is a non-government organization working on the water issues. And myself, I am a water resources engineer.
And Doug, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, you've all met Glenda. My name's Doug Parker. I'm the director of the California Institute for Water Resources, and oversee the Rosenberg program as part of my program.
Thank you all. And like everyone else on the advisory board, we are excited about today's webinar. And at this point, I'd like to ask our two moderators, Ayman Rabi and Helen Ingram, who have worked hard to put this webinar for today together. And Ayman, I'll pass on the baton to you for the rest of the meeting until the end.
So thank you very much, Sarush. Thank you, all participants and distinguished speakers, dear colleagues, and dear distinguished guests. It is a great honor for me to moderate this session together with my good friend Helen. And I hope we will be able to overcome any difficulty that might come, including technical difficulties, despite the fact that this is a very hot subject and it is a very important subject related to the Nile Basin. We managed finally to get a balanced representation from the region, and I would like to thank, on behalf of the Rosenberg Forum and the University of California and the Advisory Board, all the distinguished speakers who agreed to give us their contribution to this very important seminar. We have five distinguished speakers representing various disciplines. We have political sciences, we have hydrology, and we have economics, and we have legal and law or international law, and that also gives us a kind of a multidisciplinary insight into the subject that we are going to address. Without further speeches, Helen, do you want to say something before I just move to introduce the first speaker? No, unmute yourself, Helen.
I only want to invite people to please post their questions for the speaker in that Q&A box so that we can ask those at the end of the session. Thank you, Ayman.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen. I think just also to remind participants that we will not have questions or Q&A after each presentation, but we will have a final session for Q&A where, as just Helen mentioned, we'll have all Q&As posted in the Q&A or in the chat box. And after that, after the presenters finishing their speeches, we will have this session. And I hope you will be able to stay with us until the end so that we can address this correctly and properly. With that, I'd like to start with the first presenter, Dr. Salman Salman. Dr. Salman Salman, as you also could see from his biography, is an academic researcher, and he's a consultant in water law and policy. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Brill Research Perspective in International Water Law. He is a fellow in the International Water Association and a former World Bank advisor in water law. Dr. Salman, the floor is yours, and please just stick to the time mentioned in the presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ayman, for the introduction. Greetings, everybody. I'll be talking about the Nile Basin, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and international water law.
Dr. Salman, could you put your presentation in presentation mode, please?
Okay.
Just in the lower, yeah, there you go, in the lower.
I have to.
Okay.
I'm getting some technical assistance.
We can all use that. In the lower right, the little picture right by the slider bar, if you just click that, you'll be good to go. Right down where you see the book, right next to it.
Oh, right here.
There you go. Perfect. Well, maybe.
It's not moving.
So yeah, go up to slideshow then. Would you like us to share it for you?
Just a minute.
Yeah, maybe I don't know why it's not working.
It's not, we're clicking on the site show, but it's not moving.
Maybe
Okay.
I can share it.
Can you
Yes.
share it?
Yes, just a moment. I'm sorry. I'm opening it up. I'm sorry I didn't have it ready to go. Oh, there we go.
Seems like.
And then you cursed us with your, hopefully no technical issues. Okay.
I tried, but unfortunately seems that we, yeah.
That's okay. We're ready to go now.
Okay, fine. So we have it. You're going to do it, right?
Yes. Can you see it on your screen?
Yeah, I can see it on the screen. Yeah. Okay.
Just let me know when you want to go to next.
Okay. So we are. I hope that time is not part of my time. Whatever we have spent. Okay. So we can move to the next screen. The structure of the presentation. I'll talk about the political geography of the Nile, and then the basic principles of international water law, as opposed to the agreements on the Nile. And then I will give an overview of the programs and projects on the Nile, and that will lead us to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, where I will talk about the developments since 2011 up to now, including the agreements that were concluded, the differences between the three parties and the attempts to resolve them, and the role of the third parties. Number of third parties have been engaged, and we'll talk briefly about the role of each of them, and then we'll conclude with some remarks about possible areas of cooperation within the Nile, as opposed to the current dispute, and we'll leave the panelists to the question as to which they think the Nile Basin is flowing or heading. Next. Next, Helen.
Sure.
Okay, political geography of the Nile. Next. We heard Sarush talking about one of the greatest rivers. The Nile is one of the greatest rivers. It's the longest river in the world, 6,650 kilometers. The White Nile, one of the tributaries, originate from the largest lake, second largest lake in the world, the Lake Victoria, second largest after Lake Superior. We also have the largest swamps in southern Sudan, the Sud, what is called the Sud region. We have the oldest and largest dams, starting with the old Aswan Dam in 19th century. And then we have the oldest and most controversial treaties. And this is one basic characteristic of the Nile. Again, we hear about the Nile being the cradle of civilization. Currently, 250 million people live or depend on the Nile. And the figure expected to rise to 300 million by 2025. This represents about 10% of the African continent. And we have a huge diversity in ethnicity, religions, and linguistic diversity. The Nile is shared by 11 countries: Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. You will see later that they have varying and different interests and stakes. And it's a region of extremes, poverty. 9 out of 15 poorest countries in the world are in the Nile area. High variability and climate change. And then we also have the landscape vulnerability. Next, please. Next. It's a small flow of system. We talk about 84 billion cubic meters. Some new estimates put the figure as 109 billion cubic meters. Whatever, if it's 84 or 109, it is really small flow given the big name of the Nile. And we can see the small flow when we compare it to the Amazon. The Nile is really 2% of the Amazon. You need 50 Niles to get one Amazon. The 6% of the Congo, 12% of the Yangtze River, 17% of the Niger River, and even Zambezi River. It's 1/4 of the Zambezi River. So this is a small flow system-wide. And we have very limited infrastructure. About 10% of the hydroelectric power potential has been developed so far. 15% of the population in the 11 countries have electricity. Less than 10% of the irrigable land is irrigated. This is excluding Egypt and Sudan, which has a large area of irrigable land. And we spoke about the high rainfall variability across the basin. Ethiopia, tributaries contribute 86 to 95%, depending on the season of the year, of the flow at Aswan. High equatorial flows lost in the Sud, as I mentioned earlier. About 60% of the water coming from the White Nile is lost in the Sud. Huge area of the Sud, about 60% is lost. The White Nile contributes about 14%. This is one region. We have the variability also. We can see that in Egypt, minimal rain, no flow additions, yet 90% of the population live on 5% of the Nile land. Sudan and South Sudan have 65% of the basin area. After the independence or breakaway of South Sudan, it's about 45-20, sorry, 45 for Sudan and 20 for South Sudan. It's the basin area and the confluence of major tributaries in the two countries. Next, please. There are lots of challenges. As I mentioned, limited flow, 184 billion to 109. Increasing demand due to population growth. We mentioned the population growth, and we talked about the figure reaching 300 million. And we have the current allocation of the Nile waters, mostly used by Sudan and Egypt. We have the climate change and environmental degradation. We have major differences on international law interpretation, on the treaties, and on the current Nile Basin Cooperative Framework Agreement that was negotiated for almost 10 years. And the result of all of this is unilateral development plans. This is one basic characteristic of Nile. Unilateral development plans, you hardly find any project that is developed by two or more of the countries of the Nile. And those unilateral development plans are mainly dams, and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is one of them. Next, please. This is the areas where we have the dams. In Egypt, we have the High Dam, and we have a number of barrages. Sudan, we have a number of dams, starting with Sennar Dam, and then Roseris Dam, Jebel Aulia, and then Marawi now, and then Ethiopia, we have a number of dams, which we'll also talk about, Finsha, Tes Abai, Atane Belize, and then the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And then we have in Uganda also a number of dams, Bujagali, Koroma. So basically Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Uganda are really the countries that have the largest number of dams on the basin, on the Nile Basin. Next, please. This is the contribution of each of the Nile main tributaries. The Blue Nile, the largest of the tributaries of the Nile. The flow is 50 billion cubic meters, representing about close to 60%. That's where we have our current dispute. The White Nile, 11.5 billion cubic meters, representing 14%. The Sobat, again, 11.5, representing 14%, and the Adbara, 11, representing 13%. So we have, this is on the assumption that the total flow is 84 billion cubic meters. Distribution between the main, so we see the Blue Nile, which is the topic of our discussion today, is really the largest of all. In fact, the other three combined are still below their total flow is below the flow of the Blue Nile. Next, please. Again, this is just the comparison between the annual flow and the flood period flow, July to September. So at Barab, 13% is the annual, but 22% is the flood period, July to September, beginning of July to end of September. And the Blue Nile, the same thing, 59 is the average, but 68% comes during the flood season, during those 3 months. And this is one major problem which we'll talk about. That 68% of the total flow of the Blue Nile, where the Grand Renaissance Dam is being constructed, comes during the months of July, August, and September. So about 14% is annual, but 5% during the flood. We'll see that the total coming from Ethiopia is 86% during the annual, the average, but 95% during the flood season, while the White Nile, which is coming from the equatorial lakes, is 14% and only 5% during the flood season. So it's very, very wide variation. Next, please. This is we hear often about the Eastern Nile and Southern Nile, and I thought just to give a quick view of the Southern Nile. When we talk about the Southern Nile, we're talking about the equatorial lakes Nile, where the White Nile originates, and the main White Nile. And here we have Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. And those are the countries where Lake Victoria, the White Nile comes from Lake Victoria and enters South Sudan. And then we have the Eastern Nile, which is Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, and Eritrea. And then, but Sudan and Egypt really, and South Sudan can be classified as belonging to both the Southern Nile and the Eastern Nile. And so since we are going to talk about the Eastern Nile today, we need to keep in mind Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and to a lesser extent, Eritrea. Next, please. This is the basin area in each country. I don't want to spend much time about it. I mentioned earlier that about 65% of it in Sudan and South Sudan. Ethiopia has 11%, Egypt has about 9%, Uganda has 7%. But let's look at Uganda. It has 7%, but 99% of the country falls in the Nile basin. Similarly, Rwanda has less than 1%, but 80% of the country falls within the Nile basin. So we have, again, this variation between so many factors, and the basin area is one of them. Next. The riparian stakes and interests. I mentioned earlier that we have 11 countries, but really we can classify them into 4 categories. Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan, the stakes and the interests are very high. Uganda, the interests are high. And then we have Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, and Tanzania. The interests and the stakes are medium. And then Democratic Republic of Congo and Eritrea, the interests and stakes are very low. Democratic Republic of Congo has the River Congo, which is more than, we mentioned earlier, 20 times the Nile flow. And Eritrea really has a very minimal flow, that the Sitit River, which originates in Ethiopia, crosses into Eritrea, and then joins the Adbara River. So those are basically the stakes and interests. Next. We will talk about international water law quickly and compare that to the Nile agreements. When we talk about international water law, I'm basically talking about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Navigation and Uses of Water Courses, what is called the UN Water Courses Convention. This convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1997, and it basically represents, the basic principles there represent customary international law, meaning that all that the convention did was to codify the existing principles of customary international law, which binds every country. As I mentioned, 103 countries voted for the convention. Only 3 voted against the convention. We'll come to that in a minute. The convention was opened for signature, entered into force in 2014. It needed 35 member countries to ratify it. Currently, it has 36 parties. It's a framework convention. It is really a framework convention, meaning it lays down the basic principles and leaves the details for the parties to complement them by agreements between them. The main thing I would like to say about the convention is its cardinal principle. The cardinal base is cooperation. It talks about cooperation, cooperate, and uses the term 15 times. Cooperation, cooperate 15 times. And basically, we talk about international water law as the law of cooperation. The main principles of the convention: equitable and reasonable utilization and participation of all riparians, the obligation not to cause significant harm, and those two principles are really have been the centrifugal of the evolution of international water law. We have the notification for planned measures and exchange of data. It's another basic principle. And then we have the environmental protection and preservation and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Those are the main 5 principles of customary international law which have been codified in the convention. And as I mentioned, most provisions of the convention reflect customary international law, and as such, because of that, those provisions of customary international law bind the states, whether they are parties to the convention or not. And this has appeared in the decisions of the International Court of Justice in 2 cases where the parties at that time were not even members of the convention, but the International Court of Justice referred to the convention as representing customary international law. Next, please. Those are the countries that are members of the convention, 36, mostly in the Europe and Middle East and Africa. We can get to this during discussion if there are any questions. Next. Within the Nile countries, I thought I would stop for a minute and show where the Nile countries, the stand of the Nile countries vis-a-vis the convention. 2 countries voted for the convention, Kenya and Sudan. 4 countries abstained, but they abstained for different reasons. Each country has its own reason for abstaining. Egypt abstained, Ethiopia abstained, Rwanda abstained, and Tanzania abstained. Burundi voted against the convention. It's one of the 3 countries. The other 2 countries that voted against the convention were China and Turkey. And then the Congo and Eritrea did not participate in the discussion and the vote. Next. Go ahead. Next. We'll talk about the agreements on the Nile. We have a large number of agreements on the Nile, starting with 1891 and going on until the recent one, which is the Cooperative Framework Agreement. I don't want to go to them because that will take a lot of time, but those are most of those are called colonial treaties by some of the Nile riparian countries because they were concluded during the colonial era in Africa, and that's one major issue for the parties, that the parties, some of the upper riparians are talking about those agreements as colonial treaties which do not bind them, and while Egypt and Sudan would insist on their binding effect. Next, please. And this is particularly true. Next. This is particularly true about the 1902 treaty between Britain and Ethiopia, which gives Sudan and Egypt veto power over projects in Ethiopia, and which Ethiopia rejects, but Sudan and Egypt insist on. And the 1929 treaty between Britain and Egypt, which also gives Britain and Egypt and Sudan and Egypt as a successor the right to veto projects in the White Nile countries, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And those countries have mentioned that they have denounced the treaty and they are no longer bound by it. So those treaties are really the base of the dispute and the conflict. And then we have the 1959 Nile Waters Treaty. It is a bilateral treaty between Sudan and Egypt. None of the countries, other countries of the Nile are party to this. And the title of the treaty is the agreement for the full utilization of the Nile waters. And that is the cause of concern of the other countries, that the Sudan and Egypt have put their hands on the entire Nile waters when they talk about full utilization, which they did, because the Sudan and Egypt divided the entire Nile flow between Egypt and Sudan. And although they recognize other Nile states' rights, but they require approval of Egypt to Sudan for any allocation to those countries. That's the 1959 agreement. Next. We'll talk now about the Nile Basin Initiative and the Cooperative Framework Agreement, what's also called the NTB Agreement. Next. The Nile Basin Initiative was born officially in February 22nd in 1999 in Dar es Salaam. The Minister of Water Resources signed the vision, which is to achieve sustainable socioeconomic development through equitable utilization of and benefit from the common Nile water resources. And it recognized the rights of all states on the Nile. The main task was to prepare an inclusive treaty for the 11, at that time, 10 riparian countries. Next. This is the institutional setup of the Nile Basin Initiative, the Nile Council of Ministers. We have, that is the main body, the highest body, and then the Nile Technical Advisory Committee below it, and then the Nile Basin Initiative Secretariat, which is based in Entebbe. Next. We have in addition to this, we have two offices. The Eastern Nile Technical Regional Office in Addis Ababa for the Eastern Nile, and then the Nile Basin at the Southern Nile office in Kigali, Rwanda. As I mentioned, the negotiation started in 1999 for the Cooperative Framework Agreement, we call it CFA, facilitated by the World Bank, UNDP, other donors. The CFA was drafted and it's based largely on the UN Watercourses Convention. Hoping that some of the drafters were the ones who really drafted the UN Convention. However, the negotiations deadlocked in 2009, 10 years over three main issues. Water security, that's Article 14. Egypt and Sudan insisted on that water security means the existing uses and rights. Basically the 1902, 1929, 1959 agreement. And whereas the other country, and this is basically I'm talking about the obligation not to cause harm, existing uses and existing rights. And whereas the other countries were talking about equitable utilization. And then there is also issue of prior notification on projects and planned measures. There were major differences on those two issues and the negotiations broke down. Next. 6 countries signed the CFA, the Cooperative Framework Agreement 2020 and 2010. Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi. It's vehemently opposed by Egypt and Sudan because it does not, in their view, recognize their existing uses and rights. Thus far, it's ratified by 4 countries, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. South Sudan, it became independent in 2011. It declared its support for the CFA, but has not taken any action. Democratic Republic of Congo is undecided. The CFA needs ratification of 6 countries. So far, it has 4 countries, so it has not yet entered into force. Next. Next. This is the Nile Basin position. The Burundi, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda have signed it. Again, it's Sudan and Egypt, undecided Congo, and ratified by the 4 countries, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. Next. This is the signing of the CFA in May 2010. It was a big thing in Kenya, in Nairobi, Kenya. Next. Then now we'll come to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And just before talking about the Gird, we need to mention that this is not the first dam in Ethiopia. There are earlier dams. I mentioned Finsha, Tane Belis, and Tekezi. Tekezi is the largest. It's on the Adbara River. The announcement about the Gird was made in late March, and the construction started in April 2011, March 2011 and April 2011. At that time, Egypt was busy with the January 2011 revolution. The Gird lies 15 kilometers from the Sudanese borders, and this is one major issue for Sudan now. It's 170 meters in height, supported by a saddle dam. The lake capacity is 74 billion cubic meters of water. This compared to the Aswan High Dam of 162 billion cubic meters of water. It's about less than half. It's the largest dam in Africa and the 10th largest in the world. Next. The purpose is to generate 6,000 megawatts of electricity. It has 16 turbines, each with 375 megawatts. Construction is being done by Salini Company of Italy. The Chinese are building the transmission lines. They're not involved directly in the Gird, but in the transmission line. The Europeans are providing mechanical equipment. The cost estimates are about $5 billion, and the funding is coming from Ethiopia's own resources and bonds issued to Ethiopians. There is no foreign investment or foreign financing for the Gird. Next. The concerns of Egypt and Sudan. Egypt is concerned about the effects of reduction in water flow for irrigation, for power generation, and for storage at Aswan High Dam. Those are the 3 main concerns for Egypt. But the other concern is about the period in which the lake is to be filled. We mentioned 74 billion cubic meters. So if the shorter the period, the more problems for Egypt. Sudan acknowledges major benefits for the project. Regulation of the water flow, floods will no longer be a challenge to Sudan. The navigation will be around the year. The Sudan will be able to, because of the regulation of the flow, will be able to have 2 to 3 crop rotations a year. And the replenishment of the groundwater will be throughout the year. Can we get to the slides where we were? more.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Are we there? We at the
More,
right-
one more, two more. More, one more. One more. Just, I think we're here. Just if you could go back to the previous one. If you can. I said Sudan acknowledged major benefits, and I mentioned some of them. There are concerns. One of them is the safety of the dam. It's only 15 kilometers from the border with Sudan. And then the Sudan talks about the risks to Rosaires Dam. Rosaires Dam is about 100 kilometers from the Gird. It's a small dam of about 7 billion cubic meters. It's about 1/10 of the Gird. So there is a major concern in Sudan that if there is no coordination between the water flow from the Gird into Sudan, the Rosaires Dam could just be inundated. And then, of course, there is the concern about the period in which lake is the Gird lakes to be filled. Next. This is you could see the location of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and then the border from Sudan, and then the Rosaires Dam. This is within so between Sudan and Ethiopia. Next. Negotiations passed since 2011. Immediately after the announcement, there was fear of diplomacy between the three countries, and there were a lot of announcements from both sides, and very heightened tension. But then gradually things started settling down, and the three parties agreed to establish a international panel of experts consisting from 10 experts, 2 from each country and 4 from outside the Nile Basin. And the panel studied the project and came out with the report. I will show you the report in a minute. It's called the report of the International Panel of Experts. It has looked at the studies, and they concluded that some of the studies need to be done more in depth, particularly 2 studies on the downstream effects and the hydrology. That resulted that the past took them, the report came out in 2013, negotiations continued, and the major breakthrough happened in 2015. That is the signing of the agreement on declaration of principles signed by 3 parties. We'll see in a minute the level of at which is signed. This is a major agreement, and in my view, a major breakthrough. We'll talk about it in a minute. And then that was followed by another document that was signed by the Ministers of Water Resources and Minister of Foreign Affairs called the Hartung Document. It was concluded in December 2015. And they went on saying, agreeing that the 2 studies will be done by consultants, international consultants, and there was agreement initially on 2 firms, Artelia and Delta Rees. Then Delta Rees was replaced by BRI, and then they hired a law firm. And then that didn't work, and then started again direct negotiations with 6 ministers, Ministers of Water Resources and Ministers of Foreign Affairs. And then they established a committee called the National Independent Scientific Research Group, NISRG, which continued the negotiation. And in 2018, there was major deadlock that led to the involvement of the USA and the World Bank. A series of meetings were held in Washington, brokered by the USA and the World Bank, but that didn't work. And then Egypt resorted to the Security Council. And this is really a history-making event. This is the fairest dispute ever to go to the Security Council. I'm sorry, fairest international water dispute ever to go to the Security Council. Not, of course, all disputes go to the Security Council. And in that shape, Egypt sent a major memorandum. Ethiopia replied to the memorandum by a lengthier one. Sudan replied by another memorandum. Egypt sent a second memorandum. Ethiopia replied. Sudan replied, and then a 7th memorandum came from Ethiopia. Those memorandum, I think, together would probably come to close to 800 pages. As I said, it's a major event. We can talk about it in the question and answer session. But the Security Council wasn't really interested in getting involved. I mean, they talked and discussed it, and they were quite happy that the African Union decided to intervene. So they just left it to the African Union, and the African Union is still leading mediating the negotiations, but we'll see the number of issues that's still pending. Next.
Salman, I think we are a little bit over time. If you can just conclude, please.
I will conclude. This is international. This is the international panel of experts report. Next, I think I'm getting there. It's just the agreement on the Declaration of Principles consists of major points: principles of development, regional integration, sustainability, cooperation, and then cooperation on management of the Gird. And those 2 points will be taken, I'm sure, by Kevin and Rawia to agree on rules for first filling of the reservoir and to agree on rules for annual operation of the Gird. Those are the 2 issues that are now still pending. Priority for electricity sale to Egypt and Sudan. And then there is the principle of dam safety, which is one of the issues that Sudan is concerned about now. Next. This is the signing of the agreement in Khartoum on March 23rd, 2015. Next. We see the 3 presidents, the 3 heads of the heads of the states, President Sisi, President al-Bashir, and Prime Minister Haile Mariam. Next. This is the photo of the 3 of them. One would have hoped that this would continue, that spirit would continue. Next. I'm getting to conclusion, Ayman. Nile is a river of limited flow, as I mentioned, 84 to 109 billion cubic meters, resulting in increasing competition over its water resources. And cooperation is hampered by a number of factors: the colonial treaties and resultant upper hand of Egypt and Sudan over Nile waters, existing uses and obligation not to cause harm versus equitable and reasonable utilization, the 2 major issues for the upper riparian and lower riparian. And then, as I mentioned, that resulted in unilateral development plans, mainly dams. And treaties here are real causes of disputes, not source of cooperation. We look at treaties for any river, and we see that they are the base for cooperation. Here, they are cause for dispute. And there is, in my view, a power shift in the Nile, as shown by the CFA, and a signature by 6 countries, and ratification by 4 countries. Next, and this is the last slide, Ayman. There are large areas of possible cooperation. Ethiopia hydropower, in the Nile alone, more than 30,000 megawatts of electricity. Sudan irrigable lands, by some accounts, close to 22 million acres. Lake Victoria, source of major fisheries. South Sudan is a huge area for livestock, and Egypt industrial capabilities. I think those 5 factors, in my view, five areas of cooperation are really possible areas for cooperation. And in my view, also the CFA differences are resolvable with good will and cooperation. And one major point I always make, and Rawia may be able to talk more about it, Gird should have been a jointly owned and operated project. We have Itaipu between Brazil and Paraguay. We have Manantari between Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea, and Mali. And we have even the Nile Basin, the Rusumo project in the Kagera River between Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. So we have deep roots of conflicts, but we have large areas of cooperation. Which way are we heading? I would leave that to the audience, and after thinking about what I have said and putting it in their own account of what they understand of the Nile. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salman. I think appreciate your presentation and the very important information you have given. And yes, indeed, we exceeded the time allocated. And of course, I just wanted to make sure that we are all bound with that time. And without just further, I'd like to introduce the second speaker, Dr. Ariel Dinar.
Are you still talking?
Yes, I am. I'm okay. Just, sorry. What I was just saying, I'm introducing Ariel. Ariel is a distinguished professor of environmental economics and policy of the School of Public Policy, the University of California, Riverside. He's also an advisory member of the Rosenberg Forum, and he'll be addressing the grid, should it be a reason for cooperation or source of conflict. So Ariel, the floor is yours, and just reminding also that keeping on the time, and of course, I think you will be mentioning that you are going to place some sort of polls after or during your presentation, Ariel.
Yeah, so,
floor is yours.
So in light of cooperation, I will try to make up for some of the time that we lost. So I will build up on Salman's presentation, and will add a little bit to the points that he made in terms of what is going on in the basin. So this is the basin, a different map. We have 15% coming from the White Nile and other tributaries of the Nile, and 85% of the flow coming from the Blue Nile, which is a very major source of Nile water. And then this is the entire the entire basin. This region is a region that has that shows major unrest in terms of both domestic and regional politics. And this is, in my opinion, also one of the difficulties to come up with some one vision for the management of the Nile water. So there is a question here: how many riparian states share the Nile, both blue and white? And any of you who wants to answer is invited. Major events in the good, the majority is correct. Starting in 1882, where Great Britain colonialized Egypt and Sudan. This is the beginning of the, let's call it the modern area of, not modern, but the recent era of exchanges and conflicts on the Nile water. In the next slides, I show also some of the more detailed events, including some that have been mentioned by Salman, that show that both in terms of interests of the different states in the basin, and in terms of the local politics or domestic politics, this is a big problem in the basin that has to be overcome. I just want to mention two additional events, actually not events, but processes. The Teco Nile and Nile 2002, which was again a process of regional consultation that was supposed to lead to some fruitful results. And of course, what was mentioned by Salman, the Nile Basin Initiative. These are just two additional examples for the ongoing and endless consultation in the basin between the states, trying to bridge between opposed interests and unilateral plans to develop the basin. So again, what are the important positions on the Nile? And when I say Nile, I mean the Blue Nile, because this is the focus of my talk. So physically, Ethiopia, or the land in Ethiopia, supplies more than 85% of the water that flows into the Nile River. This gives Ethiopia, of course, the makes Ethiopia arguing that it has the right to utilize the natural resources that initiate on their own land. Egypt, on the other hand, depends almost entirely on the Nile waters. So if Egypt will not get water from the Nile, Egypt cannot exist. And this was, again, the position of Egypt all the time. And Egypt sees the dam as a major threat to the water security, to its water security, because it can regulate the water in such a way that it will not provide water for the high Aswan Dam, and also will truncate flows of water to Egypt. So both states, Ethiopia and Egypt, use some of the concepts from the international law that are orthogonal to each other. Ethiopia argues for absolute territorial sovereignty, and Egypt argues for absolute territorial integrity. And this is hard to bridge over the years. And what we have seen is that all the discussions and negotiations are about that orthogonal claims that came from Egypt and Ethiopia, who are the major opponents on that conflict. And Sudan was as well, but the major are Sudan and Ethiopia. So over the years, until 2011, Egypt was able, using its diplomatic capacity and the existing agreements, the 1929 and 1959 agreement that were bilateral agreements between Egypt and Sudan, to successfully prevent the construction of any major infrastructure in the land of Ethiopia. And for those years until 2011, the role was that Ethiopia was always the party that complained to the international institutions. In 2011, following some unrest in Egypt, Ethiopia was able to, after not being able to do it, was able to raise funds from both domestically and bonds that were issued to the diaspora. Many Ethiopians outside of Ethiopia contributed and bought these bonds. And the role between Egypt and Ethiopia changed now. Ethiopia is now showed facts on the ground, and the Gird, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, is a fact, and a new fact and a new reality in the region. So the question is, what is next? And here is what we suggested in some work that we did that was published also. So a different approach is needed, and this approach that everyone is talking about is needed. And this approach calls for cooperation. And the point is not just to use the word cooperation, but to show economically that cooperation will be attractive to all the parties in the basin. And again, I am talking mainly about the Blue Nile. Oh, one moment. So, I'm sorry that, please fill the questionnaire so I can see the text behind it, because otherwise I cannot see the text. So, so the question is, what could these countries in the basin do in order to take into account the existing Gird? The Gird is now a reality, and the question is whether or not some of the benefits that the Gird produces can be utilized and realized by the different states in the basin. So putting politics aside, which is probably going to be very difficult in the region because of some long history of protracted conflict, if just politics can be put aside and focus can be put on the potential benefits, let me try to, oh, thank you. Moving from, okay, so just to answer the long-term mean flow is 98 billion cubic meters. So this is the answer. Putting politics aside may be hard, but moving to a concept of benefit sharing rather than water sharing. So water sharing is the basis for the claims and arguments by the states, or the major one, and agreeing on a mechanism to share the joint incremental benefits, which is not easy, but this might be one of the solutions to the region. So keeping also in mind what is around the corner, if not already there, the consequences of climate change and population growth that were mentioned also by Salman. So taking all of that into account, what I will try to do is to introduce a principle of water rights, allocate, and trade. And as long as we agree, or the countries in the basin agree that water rights, as long as whatever they were allocated to the countries, whatever treaty is the one to be the basis for the water rights, but as long as they can trade the water rights and then exchange benefits, this could be, with some trust building between the states in the basin, could be relevant and acceptable to all. So what I'm going to present in the next 2 or 3 slides is the following. First of all, the different water right scenarios that have been discussed in the past, then developing an economic model for the basin that can assess the benefits, the overall benefits with and without water trade between the countries, and with and without the Gird, the dam. I will introduce the concept of social planner, and this is a supra-basin authority that looks at the benefits of the entire basin without taking into account political boundaries and the different interests of the countries, just the entire basin, and leaving the allocation of those benefits to a second stage. We will also talk about unilateral developments rather than joint developments of the benefits from the water in the basin. So first of all, the water rights, WRA, as I will call them, there are about 5 publications, and I just used here 3, that came up with some suggestions how to allocate both the share and the long-term flow between the different Blue Nile states, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. One is the suggested WRA1 that was suggested by Dale Withington in their 1995 publication. Another WRA, or another allocation of rights, is by the United Nations 1997 International Water Law, Article 5, and we based it on the 1960 population because it talks about needs. And then WR3 based on Beaumont publication. So these are some, there are 2 more, but just for the interest of time, I will not talk about them. So we developed a model, a regional model of all the economies of the states of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And we used several parameters that were of interest to us. First of all, without Gird, and then with Gird. And then for each of these 2 major scenarios, without trade and with trade. Trade, of course, of water. I'm not talking about trade of goods. So we have here 4 combinations of scenarios. And for each of the water right allocations, WRAs, we calculated based on reasonable assumptions that can be changed if somebody does not accept them. The economic benefits to the entire basin that have now to be allocated between the different states in terms of an allocation scheme that will be agreeable to all of them. The percentage of the best allocation, which is defined as a social planner allocation. And we can see that there are differences with preferences to the Gird and the trade. So the green line is the line or the column that produces the highest or the most preferred outcomes, which is the Gird and with trade of water rights. So just to save on time, I will skip the rest of the slide and move to the next slide. So this is, what I would like to you to take home is that there is a zone of agreement between, if we look at the, put again, politics aside and look at the economic benefits, there is a zone of agreement that all the three states can share. It is indeed small, as you can see. This is a zone of agreement. It is small, and there is a solution, at least an economic solution. The trick is how to make that area, small area, how to extend it. And I think that technically speaking, all the countries in the basin can do that. And what I will do in probably the next slide is to add one more aspect that have not been discussed so far, which I think is one of the most important obstacles for an agreement on the Nile. And this is the issue of source degradation in the Nile water. And I claim that the resource degradation is much more severe in the basin than water scarcity. And what we see in the picture here is the muddy water of the Nile that are the result of soil erosion that comes from the highland, Ethiopian highland, close canals and reservoirs in downstream countries. So
Ariel, you are 1 minute over. Ariel.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
So I will conclude. I will go to the next. What I wanted to say is that following, this is my last slide, the feature to promote future regional cooperation in the Nile Basin is that it seems that the cooperation has potential attractiveness. Some fresh thinking is needed in order to bring it to the negotiation table. We need to be able to expand the cake or to increase that zone of agreement where all the states have an interest, such as water, electricity, flood control, and soil erosion. There is also a possibility to link issues, which is a tactic in order to get out of a gridlock, where the riparian states are inversely related with their interest, such as water allocation and trade agreements, regular trade agreements of goods and energy transactions between the states. These could be there. And then benefit sharing rather than water sharing that, again, need some trust building between the countries. So with that, I will stop here because I made a promise to save time and I was not able to make my promise.
Thank you very much, Ariel. I think that's absolutely fine. I mean, we're trying to be also as much flexible as possible, but for the time's sake and just also understanding that some people might have other obligations too. So I'd like also to move immediately to the third speaker, Dr. Kevin Wheeler. He's an Oxford Martin Fellow at the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford. Dr. Wheeler, thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours. I'd just like to remind again for the time and to sticking on and to the time so that we also have the other speakers speak and the rest of participants attending till the end. Dr. Wheeler.
Dr. Wheeler, we're seeing your shared, there you go. Perfect.
Dr. Wheeler, you're muted.
Well, that probably works better if I turn off the mute. It's an honor to have an opportunity to speak with this distinguished panel, and I will try to get through in my time. I know we're a little bit behind, but the talk is called "Understanding and Managing New Risks on the Nile with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam." And we'll see part of this is based on a paper that we did published recently. And that included with Dr. Eva Zagona, Dale Whittington, Mark Julin, and Jim Hall, and also we're very frequent with Jamal Abdo at the University of Khartoum, as well as Mohammed Bashir in Manchester, and many other people on these issues. So don't need to go through this very extensively, obviously, but we know the sources of the Nile with Lake Victoria and Lake Tana, the Victoria Albert Nile flowing into the Sud wetland, White Nile, and the Blue Nile, and then flowing northward into the up into the Mediterranean through the High Aswan Dam. Okay, here's the location of the dam, just upstream of the border. So the dam itself is located just upstream of the border with an annual flow of about 49 billion cubic meters. With a storage of about 74 billion cubic meters. The active storage on that is about 59 billion cubic meters. So it can store actively manage about 1.2 times the average annual flow within the active zone of the reservoir. The dam itself, for some of the engineers out there, the main dam is about is a 155 meter high dam. Saddle Dam is about a 50 meter high dam, a low head dam. But very long, about 5.2 kilometers in length to be able to allow the storage for the full volume. Now, why, or what's the justification for the dam? We'll do a few plots here. So the energy consumption per capita, if you looked at all of the Nile Basin countries, you'll see one country stands far and away more, and that's Egypt on the top. If you were to look at just these lower countries here, we would see they're all fairly similar, but a couple of them are shooting up rapidly, Sudan and Ethiopia. So a growth rate in terms of power consumption. In terms of access to electricity, we can see here's all the three different countries, their percent access to electricity. Egypt sits with about 100% access. It's not always perfect electricity, but at least there's good access in most of the country, pretty much all of the country, rural and urban. Sudan, about a 60% access to electricity. In Ethiopia, around a 40% access to electricity as of 2018. The vast majority of electricity sources for Ethiopia comes from hydropower, pretty much all of it. Where Egypt, you can see the vast majority of it in the yellow comes from natural gas. And today, only a very small portion of the energy comes from electricity. And Sudan, most of it comes from hydropower as well right now. So driving this is the economic growth in the countries, and we can see the continued growth pattern per capita of all three countries. But we particularly note the GDP growth in percentage of Ethiopia around 2000 since the 2000s or so stayed pretty consistent, 5 to 10% growth per capita. So showing just incredible growth in that country and driving a lot of these projects.
So how significant will this dam be? What is 15? So here is the energy generation, or Ethiopian energy production, is the dark black line up through 2018. And the Gird will add on about 15 terawatt hours per year of energy generation. So roughly doubling the total energy generation within the country. Incredible step change in terms of what's available. And the challenge, of course, is the distribution lines, whether they can get that electricity distributed to such a wide population, diffuse population. We can see there's a gap in between the total consumption and total production. So a lot of the energy is also planned to be sold to the neighboring countries, Sudan, Djibouti, and Kenya. And there is existing power lines in place, as well as planned power lines in place right now. So part of it will be through the power sales, particularly to these three countries and into the East African power pool as well. So some quick overview of the hydrologic trends in the basin, just so we have a good understanding. The thickness of the lines in this well-known plot by Blackmore-Whittington represents the total flows in the different areas. And we can see that about 30% of the flows come from the White Nile that flow into Egypt. 57%, as Dr. Salman said, roughly come down the Blue Nile. About 13% come down the Bara River for the total flow into Lake Nasser. And about 53% of that comes above the Gird. So oftentimes people say how the Gird can control the Nile. Well, it can control a portion of it, but not all of it. There's a lot of tributaries that it cannot control. So yeah, about 53%. So how has the hydrology looked over time? Well, if you look at the dam site near the Gird, near the Rosaires Dam or the LDM gauge, it's been very consistent, actually, maybe a slight increase through time with some large periods of high flows and large periods of low flows, but no particular strong trend in terms of wetting or drying. The naturalized flow, if you were to remove all the dams and you were to correct for all of the consumption upstream, at the Aswan Dam, projection is more or less it's increasing a little bit, so a little bit more water over time. Not tremendously, but certainly appears to be an increasing trend. However, the actual flows at Dongola, just upstream of the Sudanese-Egyptian border, does show a downward trend, and that's driven primarily by consumption within Sudan. So that's the only significant effect upstream currently is the water use within Sudan. So the paper that I'll refer to frames a sort of a new framing of the forthcoming risks, and we really break it into three eras. The first era, the filling of the Gird period. The second era, what we'll call a new normal after the filling is complete. And the third, a multi-year drought. What would happen once a large drought like the 1980s would occur again? So the first question here, filling the Gird. So to get a good idea of the engineering of the Gird and the process, this is a profile, not necessarily the scale of the Gird, but it'll show you in the first year, which happened in 2021 or 2020, last summer, 4.9 billion cubic meters were filled, and that's about 9% of the average annual flow at the Gird site, or about 5% of the natural flow into Egypt. The second year, which is coming up this year, they intend to capture 13.5 billion cubic meters. And then after that, years 3, 4, 5 would add another 30.9 billion cubic meters to get up to a level of 625 meters for the annual operation. And after that, they would operate in this flood zone every year. It's sort of their described plan right now. So we're about to start year number 2, or later on this summer, of the filling process. Of course, with a lot of dispute on that. The High Aswan Dam, this is a quick profile of it, and it's very full right now. We're near the top, and we'll show a plot next that demonstrates this. But what they have is a drought management plan. So as the reservoir level falls, they start reducing their usage, their releases down into Egypt from the High Aswan Dam. So here's a demonstration of the storage level since 1992, and we can see how full the Aswan Dam is currently, and we can see how they've been keeping the reservoirs high. They haven't been going down. This is their maximum elevation, and their minimum elevation. Below that, this level of 147 meters, there would be very abrupt and unplanned reductions. So they want to stay away from this level at all costs. Now, they would normally have this flood operation space. And we can see they've been trying to maintain the reservoir high, really in anticipation of the Gird, is the likely reason, but through a lot of water conservation efforts. Now, if it falls below 60 billion cubic meters, they start reducing their releases down into Egypt by 5%, and then by 10% if it's below 55, and then if it's below 50 billion cubic meters by 15%. So that's their drought management policy. And the question is really, how low will the Aswan Dam fall? We know that it'll fall to a certain extent, but the question is, how low will it fall during the filling period? So here's the historical storage of the Aswan Dam, a little bit of a wider range. And if we simulate all of the different possible, all the different hydrologies of the past, we can get kind of a distribution of how low it will possibly go. And we can see with this distribution, if every year is equally probable, a few conclusions. The Aswan Dam will certainly fall to lower levels that hasn't been seen in recent years. Fortunately, we're in the second year and it's already still very full, so we're hoping it's going to stay full throughout and we'll have some wet years. But it's likely the reservoir will fall. However, the most likely case is the reservoir will not fall low enough to get below these shortage levels. So most likely no shortages would be required in Egypt as a result of the filling of the dam. However, Egypt might invoke some possible precautionary measures to try to avoid any risk of critical shortages falling down below this thick red line here, because that would be detrimental. So they may opt to reduce some of the releases to be precautionary. There's a low possibility, but there always is one, that the Aswan Dam would fall to critical levels where there would be large shortages. Now, the risks to filling are really currently fall in Sudan. So what are those risks and what are the nature of those risks? So Sudan has the small reservoir Rosari, small in comparison to the Gird, that sits immediately downstream of the Gird reservoir. So we can see that it's about 5.8 billion cubic meters is the storage of that reservoir. And so as the Gird reservoir filled up in their first 4.9 billion cubic meters, that number was just a little bit larger than the entire storage of the Rosari's reservoir. So the result of that was there was a temporary stop of flows during the filling period. That filling period of that first portion took about a week or so, more or less a week or so to fill up that first part of it. And that caused a lot of reaction within Sudan and what the potential risks were, because obviously they would not be able to hold on to the storage in that reservoir if it were full to start with. Usually it's fairly empty by the time the beginning of the rainy season starts. So a very critical time for Sudan to work together with Ethiopia. So the second year of the filling, well, it did refill, of course, during the wet season. So then during the second period of the fill, when Ethiopia wishes to capture another 13.5 billion cubic meters. Now that's obviously more than double the volume of the Sudanese reservoir downstream. So there could a very significant chance, if there were no mitigating operations, that it would have an impact on Sudan during this period. However, they have low river diversion outlets, bottom outlets, and turbines that the Gird or the Ethiopia could be using to make releases downstream. And that, of course, strategic coordinator releases to try to work with Sudan to make sure that their needs are met during this filling period will be a very, very critical requirement to avoid any harm in Sudan. So in 2022, they'll add another 10.5 billion cubic meters as sort of the Ethiopia's primary plan. 2023, another 10.4 billion cubic meters. In 2024, fill it up to the top of their regular operation level. So throughout this period, there'll certainly be a need to manage in strategic coordinator releases to make sure there's not negative impacts within Sudan, for sure during this time. And then it'll oscillate after that up at the very top. But however, through all this time, there's a very significant challenge, and really highlights the importance of coordination, as was mentioned before. If large flows are released and Sudan is not prepared for those flows, Sudanese reservoirs do stand a significant risk of being overtopped. So that's a very, very important reason for Ethiopia and Sudan to cooperate and to communicate on a technical level about how much water is being released at all times so Sudan knows and can prepare for what releases should be coming down. It is incredibly important for safety reasons for the Rosaires Dam that this coordination take place. So in the second era, we'll call the new normal condition, after the Gird is filled and no substantial new developments or withdrawals have occurred, what we see under this new normal, a new normal situation. So if the Aswan Dam is in the black and the Gird is in the blue, this is the storage levels. The dotted line would be before the Gird existed, and the solid line is afterwards. And we can see there's actually not too much of a change because the Gird is really a non-consumptive reservoir other than some evaporation. So under average hydrologic conditions, we would see that the Aswan Dam would probably recover. It'll likely recover, but it'll likely operate at somewhat of a lower level. The inflows to the Aswan Dam would be more predictable than they have before because of the operation of the Gird. The extremes would be buffered coming into the Aswan Dam. So it'd be slightly lower in some areas, slightly higher in other areas. During this new normal time, really there's a fairly minimal risk to Egypt as long as there's not a large additional consumption upstream. Really this new normal would be a fairly minimal risk to Egypt and require minimal cooperation. So essentially during this new normal period, this era 2, the outflows would essentially be equal to the inflows, except for evaporation losses over the long run. The minimal coordination would be needed. However, good data exchange will still be extremely important. You will see significant benefits for Ethiopia and Sudan, and really a minimal risk to Egypt during this new normal. However, the risk is becoming complacent, and it would be very, very unfortunate if there was not an agreement before a multi-year drought would strike. We'll see why. So under a typical drought, what might we expect? Well, typically there's going into a drought, a period during a drought, and then exiting a drought, sort of 3 different stages, sort of demonstrated by the timeline here. So what would happen if the 1980s drought occurred without the Gird? The 1980s was obviously a very critical time in the Horn of Africa and had a significant effect. So what we do is we simulate what would happen right now, even without the Gird. This is the storage level of the Aswan Dam. And this is the critical storage level down at the bottom, equivalent to the 147 meters, where the turbines would shut down. They couldn't get enough releases out from the dam to supply Egypt. Even without the Gird, we would see the levels of the Aswan Dam get very low if that drought reoccurred. That just happened in the 1980s. There's our period before, our drought onset period. There's our drought recovery period. Afterwards, it actually didn't stay down for very long and went back up again. But we know that the Aswan Dam would fall below all of those 3 management policy trigger lines, causing shortages. So this represents the amount of shortage to Egypt in billion cubic meters. So 55.5 billion cubic meters is how much Egypt strives to withdraw from the river, is their perceived allocation. And it would result in shortages based on their own policies of 6 to 8 billion cubic meters in several years. That's what happens without the Gird in place. The Aswan Dam would reach this near this critical level. Now, however, if the Gird were upstream and had water available in it, and it released a continuous energy generation, what we would see is the black line here, and it would actually mitigate some of the effects in the beginning. What we would see is lower shortages during the first part, and it would shift to shortages greater shortages during the exit of the drought, or during the recovery portion of the drought. So we can see there'd be 15 billion cubic meters less of shortages during that initial part, an additional 7 billion cubic meters of shortages to Egypt after that part. So essentially shifts that down. So this is actually a fairly good situation for Egypt when there's extra water upstream to be able to release that water. However, we can really focus on this recovery period and get an idea, get a feeling of how difficult this will be. Both reservoirs are in very low situations, and both reservoirs have to recover.
Kevin, Kevin, I think we are over time as well, so just if possible.
Okay, I'll finish here for now. So, so we can see the Gird would actually fall down to the bottom along this, and it would be very difficult to recover. It'd be this is unstable situation for Ethiopia. So this drought recovery period, both countries would want to recover as soon as possible. They have to prioritize what order should the reservoirs be refilled, which are the most critical needs, whether it's domestic or power generation. And then we can really think what constitutes coordination. This is our final slides here. So we think of this continuum of cooperation. First is just a basic data exchange, perhaps a filling agreement, shared operating plans, and then sharing possible critical situations like drought operation planning or flood operation planning, moving farther along a continuum of cooperation. And then finally, releases for sort of an idealized situation, which as Dr. Dinar was saying, if you're able to do economic optimization, but that takes a lot more coordination than where they're currently at right now. So moving along this continuum step by step, incremental. So the summary message is the Gird intercepts about 55 more or less % of the natural flows in Egypt. Gird is non-consumptive and cannot stop the average flows of the Nile. The operation, though, can delay the recovery during critical periods. Egypt is currently well prepared to manage the filling. However, Sudan is at the greatest risk immediately due to the filling. And a long-term drought management plan is absolutely critical before it occurs. And that is all. And with that, please.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. That's really appreciated. And it is very interesting, rich information. Thank you so much. We are already like 15 minutes behind our schedule. And now just also moving to our fourth distinguished speaker, Dr. Rawia Tawfiq from Egypt. She is an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University. Dr. Rawia, we are honored to have you here with us, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabi, and thanks for all the organizers. It's a pleasure to join such a distinguished panel in a timely, to speak about a very timely and pressing issue. I'm trying to share my screen, but I think there is the main problem here. I think someone has to stop. Okay, I think Kevin already stopped sharing his slides. So.
I think you should, there you go.
Yeah. I think what I will do in the next 20 minutes is to try to take a different approach. So we heard a lot of numbers, good background in terms of legal issues, hydrology, and so on. And as a hydropolitics scholar, I will take a bit of a political approach, speaking about what has worked in terms of successful negotiations in some cases, what has worked even during the last 10 years of Gird negotiations, and what has not worked, and what lessons can be learned, and what are the basic reasons why an agreement on the filling and operation of the Gird has been so far not successful. So I'll start with the enabling conditions for successful negotiations from other experiences as suggested by scholars of water diplomacy, and then move to cooperation on the Gird, and as I said, what has worked in the past during the last 10 years. And then speak about the reasons for failing to reach an agreement on the filling and operation. What are the details that made reaching this agreement impossible so far? And then conclude with a couple of points that may suggest some clues to a way forward. So in the last couple of decades, scholars of water diplomacy has actually studied different experiences of successful negotiations in different international water courses. And they came to the conclusion that we have different enabling conditions at different stages, starting from the initiation of negotiations, and then sustaining these negotiations, and then the implementation of the agreement, and involving any third parties. And also, the idea of the process of learning that takes place during this long negotiation. And they identified a number of points that I try to highlight, because some of them are quite relevant to the negotiations on the Gird. And I'm glad that Professor Salman already gave some background about the, the long marathon of negotiations between the three countries. So at the level of, or at the stage of initiating any negotiation, we have to have, a recognition of the value of interdependence. The role of leadership can be facilitative here in terms of commitment to cooperation, but there has also to be political willingness, to offer compromises and management of the expectations of the public in order to offer these compromises. And I think this is a very critical point as far as Gird negotiations are concerned, and also an understanding of complexity, that with the high level of uncertainty that we're facing in many river basins, there has to be cooperation to, manage this uncertainty. But then in order to achieve, a successful conclusion of an agreement, there has to be also an attempt by all parties to achieve mutual gains. And this can happen through things like joint fact finding, for instance, because oftentimes, facts that are presented by only one party is being contested by other parties, and creating more values. This can be, more water in the system, more efficiency, or even more benefits beyond the river, and also trying to find some sort of ways through the deadlocks, through issues like compensation. Professor Dinar already mentioned issue linkage. But it's very important at this stage during negotiations that all parties commit not to take any unilateral action that will actually threaten negotiations. So it does not make any sense for parties to be, involved in negotiations and one party is taking, unilateral action that is actually, not offering a enabling political environment to make these negotiations successful. What's sometimes also interesting is to have a space for what's called ambiguity or strategic ambiguity. Sometimes you have to leave some political sensitive issues aside in order to reach an agreement. Otherwise, you will be actually going through vicious circles without reaching any agreement. In order for implementation to be successful, I think this is pretty straightforward. You need to have sharing of data, joint and efficient authority that is given, enough capacities and authorities to monitor the implementation of the agreement, and also an effective conflict for resolution of any disputes that may occur in the implementation of the agreement, and that is accepted by all parties. But interestingly, also some scholars spoke about, the process of learning that is involved in these long negotiations in any international water course. The process of learning means basically that parties have to adjust their actions. Sometimes this adjustment can go even deeper to reach the, the values and assumptions of different parties, and even the paradigms, the way of thinking that shape both actions and values. And I think this point is very relevant, and I'll touch on that when I come to the case of the Gird. And in all these stages, initiation, negotiation of an agreement and implementation of the agreement, there can be third-party involvement. This is especially important in highly politicized context. But of course, third parties have to have high stakes in the involvement of this region, and in this case, also high influence, i.e. ability to obtain concessions from different parties. And their involvement has to be not just, technical, but sometimes also political and long-term. But what is important here is that even if we have interested parties with enough, influence, it is up to the main parties, main core riparian states, to based on their goodwill, to reach an agreement, because of the the successful third-party mediation is conditional on the parties recognizing that there is a high cost of non-agreement and that their goals cannot be reached actually through unilateral actions. And I think this is also a critical point that I will come to when I speak about the Gird. Of course, I will not, speak about, the 10 years of negotiations over the Gird, because I need simply ages to speak about that. But let me just try to highlight some milestones that are important and link them, their success or failure, to the elements or factors that I've just mentioned. So First of all, it has to be recalled that as Professor Salman mentioned, this dam was constructed unilaterally while Egypt, as he said, was busy with the ramifications of the 2011 revolution. And just after the construction, consultations started in order to, start a process of examining the documents related to this dam and see what are the potential impacts on downstream Egypt and Sudan. And here I'm quoting one of the members of the international panel of experts. I think Professor Salman already spoke about the IPOE, which was basically formed of 2 members of the 3 countries, in addition to 4, international experts. And he said that the reason why this IPO process was successful in delivering specific objectives was, first of all, political will, or at least, the desire by the parties to show goodwill. The very specific technical scope of their work, it was not about legal issues or affected by any political meddling, but basically focusing on, as I said, examining the documents of the project and try to offer recommendations. And they focus more on the issues rather than the countries. And they involved international experts with, with high professional conduct. And last, the construction of the Gird was at the early stage, which left some room for improvement on issues like safety, for instance. But Ethiopia was determined at that time to keep that track separate from what it's taking on the ground. So only, a few days before the IPOE submitted its report, Ethiopia already, diverted the Nile in order to start building the body of the main dam. The Declaration of Principle was, as Professor Salman mentioned, a very important milestone, because for month and month after the IPOE submitted its report recommending that more studies have to be conducted on the downstream impacts of the Gird, the 3 countries were not able to basically agree on what international firms will conduct these studies and the terms of reference. And Egypt had to withdraw for about 6 months in early 2014. But the change in leadership in Egypt allowed for this breakthrough of signing the DOP to happen. And on the one hand, we can see that the Declaration of Principle, which I agree with Professor Salman, that it's an important and historic document. On the one hand, the DOP was trying to search for these mutual gains that is necessary for the successful of any international agreement on water courses or on specific projects on international water courses. So it, as Professor Salman mentioned, it basically stipulated that joint studies on the Gird's impact, downstream impacts, will be conducted by the 3 countries, and based on these studies, the 3 countries will agree then on the filling and operation of the Gird, and that there will be a coordination mechanism for the operation and filling of the Gird, and a dispute settlement mechanism, in addition to the normal principles of information sharing. But it also added an element of cooperation beyond water, speaking about power trade, that Gird's electricity can be actually exported to both Egypt and Sudan. But what was also interesting is that the DOP was ambiguous on sensitive issues, which was important to reach the stage of signing this agreement on the Declaration of Principles. So it's left the sensitive political issues aside, and this is especially the case for water shares, because water shares, as you listen from Professor Salman and also from Professor Dinar, are quite contested, and even I think the schemes provided by Professor Dinar in this context of water allocation and trade is actually will be a non-starter for Egypt, for instance. But the idea was that let's keep the idea of water shares, controversial water shares, aside, and reach an agreement on the principles of cooperation that I've just mentioned, in order for the 3 countries, especially Egypt and Ethiopia, to be able to have an agreement that can be presented to its constituency. But then moving to from principles to, detailed, rules and guidelines for filling an operation, this proved to be very challenging in the last 5 years. And I want here to make a statement, a clear statement, that as we heard from earlier speakers, achieving Egypt and Sudan water security and even food security, and Ethiopia's energy security is technically achievable, right? Economically feasible, and also politically desirable, because as Professor Dinar said, we have already other sources of instability in the region, so we do not need any further sources of instability. But I think the main point and the main reason why there has been this, adamant rejection of Ethiopia to, to agree on the draft proposed in Washington, for instance, which was the result of 9 different rounds of negotiations from, November 2019 to February 2020. Is basically that it perceived the cost of non-agreement as not as high as the benefits of non-agreement. So basically, while Egypt, for the reasons mentioned by Professor Salman, Egypt being the most arid country in the region, suffering from water scarcity, and will be reaching absolute water scarcity in just 4 years, it is important for Egypt to reach an agreement. But this is not the case in Ethiopia, because basically, following the development of events, we will find that the optimistic statements made by the 3 countries in different rounds of negotiations were actually finally, threatened by the position of Ethiopia, which suggested to the 2 countries, basically to Sudan and Egypt, in a visit by the delegation led by Hailemariam Desalegn, the former Ethiopian Prime Minister, just a few days before the much anticipated signing of Washington Agreement, that Ethiopia would like to delay the signing because it's facing some domestic issues that relate basically to preparation for elections, and that it will be very politically costly for Ethiopia to sign an agreement now. So this use of political, of the Nile issue for political ends, of course, has been used for decades by the 3 countries. But as far as this stage of, signing a much anticipated agreement after 5 years of negotiation is concerned, I think the main reason was, Ethiopia's, domestic politics and non-ability of the leader to be able to mobilize, the public for compromises. So what we found is actually extreme positions that are trickling down, unfortunately, to the popular level. So it's not just, statements, official statements, but also even social media campaigns by our Ethiopian brothers that is actually not only celebrating the Gird as a national project, but also using a very exclusionary language, like Nile for Ethiopia, for instance. Trying to portray, the international river that is bringing this 11 countries together as a national river that Ethiopia has the absolute right to use. And, for this reason that I've just mentioned, Ethiopia simply rejected to sign a binding agreement, and they just suggested that it can be rules that Ethiopia, as an owner of the dam, can change, any time in the future and inform the other 2 countries. And as we have just heard from Kevin, it's really highly risky for Sudan, and also risky for Egypt, even if the probability is low. And of course, Kevin, I think when he spoke about filling, it was basically about filling also in normal situations, but Egypt is very concerned about filling an operation in drought and prolonged drought periods. also in the negotiations, it was evident that Ethiopia is trying to bring other issues that is actually complicating negotiations, like CFA, for instance. So it's quite ironic that while Ethiopia has been claiming for decades that Egypt is trying to impose historical agreements that Ethiopia actually signed on the Nile, now Ethiopia is trying to force the CFA on both Egypt and Sudan, linking the Gird filling an operation agreement to Egypt and Sudan accepting in 10 years a water sharing agreement on the basis of the CFA, which not only Egypt and Sudan, but other countries, as we heard from Professor Salman, have either not ratified or not signed in the first place. Ethiopia, and I'm mentioning that also because we spoke about benefit sharing rather than water sharing, and I think Egypt tried to propose something in that direction a few months after signing the CFA, proposing a trilateral infrastructure fund that can mobilize funds for the three countries in other projects. But the Ethiopians seem to have considered that as a distraction from the main issue of Gird filling and operation and Nile utilization and so on and so forth. So the very idea of trying to expand benefits is very much also met with some reservation by Ethiopia. And for all these reasons, there have been disagreements on the role of third parties, as you may have been following, speaking about the U.S. and the World Bank shifting from observers to contributors to drafting the agreement that was made in Washington. Although, as I mentioned, the World Bank and the U.S. made or contributed to this draft based on the inputs from different countries. Now the same is happening with the AU mediation. Sudan is suggesting more role for EU experts. Both Egypt and Ethiopia they do have reservations on that, and the result is limited, influence for both parties for all the mediation efforts that have been exerted so far.
Dr. Rawia, the time is over. I appreciate if you can conclude.
Yeah, I'm concluding now. It is, can now get to the idea that we have whereas we had some sort of adjustment and learning on the part of Egypt by trying to transcend all the debate about, water shares and not starting, the agreement on filling and operation of the Gird based on the previous water shares, or the discussion of the filling and operation of the Gird without the conduct of the required studies on downstream impacts. Ethiopia has not changed either its actions or its basic assumptions and claims of sovereignty, of absolute sovereignty over the Nile. Professor Salman spoke about the risks that Sudan is now focusing on. And this takes us basically to two points that I want to conclude with. First of all, that when speaking about moving forward, we have to think about, moving from optimal solution that Ethiopia is looking for more to optimal spaces. So we have, at least on the short term, to leave complex political issues aside that cannot be resolved in 2 or 3 years and focus on what can be attained in terms of this specific Gird project, and also build, a supportive public opinion, which has not been the case in the last few years. And for third-party intervention, I think, the international community need to engage and to remain engaged, not just at the technical level, but also at the political level, and transcend the feeling of fatigue from different, from following or engaging in these negotiations, or just the diplomatic wish well that we heard following the United Nations Security Council meeting, and try to reach out to different parties to support reaching a win-win solution. Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia, and I look forward to yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rawia. That's very interesting perspective as well, and it's very interesting. Now, our final speaker, Dr. Semu Moges. He's a professional civil engineer and international consultant, He's also a research fellow and associate at the University of Connecticut in the USA. Dr. Semo, thank you very much for accepting the invitation and to be part of this distinguished panel. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen first. Yeah, can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored to present what recently I composed some of the important issues on Nile. My topic is the Gird negotiation is beyond Gird issues. I think facing the facts together now than facing the consequences later. So I'm a hydrologist by profession, but I'm trying to put some of hydropolitical concepts also. Please allow me to ask all of you, please open up into a broader course than a narrow understanding of the Nile. And also we have to a little bit include some sympathetic human situations. Most of the issues that we discussed so far was on the Nile. There is a big problem I would like to show you on the part of the catchment of Blue Nile, as I think Arian alluded. So my presentation will be some background information on the Nile and Blue Nile, and some of the issues that already discussed. Most of my presentation is also alluded by many speakers, and changing approach to progressive negotiation to build trust and bring cooperation. And if time allows, I would like to show you one experimental example that I did. So we have already discussed the Nile Basin. There are two water source regions in Ethiopia and the equatorial region. The equatorial region generates more water than it contributes to the source of the Blue Nile because of the swamps. And then the Ethiopian generates more water and supplies more water. So it's a generator and a source area in terms of hydrology. I would like to go into the hydrology. As you can see, these are the two source regions. The South Sudan generates more rainfall than Ethiopia even, but most of the water remains in the swamps here. And most of the water coming from the southern part of this area are steady and predictable, whereas most of the water coming from Ethiopia causes the highest variability of the Nile flow. This is a Nile flow at Dongola, close to Egypt. So you can see seasonally also this area from Ethiopia, most of the water is contributed within 3 to 4 months, whereas the rainfall from the southern part of the Nile is more of a steady 7 to 8 months. So more water comes from Ethiopia within a short period of time. And as you can see, Ethiopia, 70% of the water, is located in the Nile part. The whole surface water of Ethiopia is located in the Nile basin, and only 30% of the water is generated from other 8 to 9 basins, which constitutes almost 70% of Ethiopian land generates only about 30% of surface water. And from literature, you can see 75% of Ethiopia is also dry land. So this, as much as this water, the Nile water is important for Egypt, Sudan, it's also important for Ethiopia. So there has to be a way that the 3 of the countries benefit. This is a Blue Nile flow already. Kevin have already shown also. It's highly variable because of the variable nature of rainfall. And if I draw the average 4 to 5 years of flow, you can see immediately the variability, the lower flows improve. Means we have two big dams like Gird and Aswan, and we cannot talk in terms of annual variabilities. We can talk in terms of 2, 3, 4 average years, average flows, because of the huge capacity to dampen the hydrology flows. So this is the hydrology. And the other important thing I would like to discuss is the hydrology of the Blue Nile, or the catchment hydrology of the Blue Nile. Recently, with my colleague, what we did was we generated a surface runoff index, drought index, soil moisture index, and rainfall index. So you can see in the catchments of the Blue Nile, if you see this one, you can say there is high rainfall where the high runoff, where there is low rainfall, at the same time low soil moisture, which means there was intense rainfall where it was not available for agriculture. It was not also available for other activities. So you can see the drought conditions, the upper part of catchment varies, whereas in Sudan and Egypt, you can see that most of flow goes, even though there is agricultural drought. You can also see these drought conditions whereby the soil moisture in Ethiopia is better for agriculture, while the rainfall, meteorological conditions shows drought condition, which means there was a very less intense distributed rainfall, and the soil moisture was good and runoff generation was good. So this is another condition that this. The third condition you can see is that at times rainfall would be high, runoff would be high, but agricultural conditions would be affected. So you can see different conditions of drought conditions in the Blue Nile part of the catchment as you closely. If you zoom into different subcatchments, this become more, this is at the basin level. So it is not a boundary condition. It is not a binary condition. The Blue Nile is not a drought situation or no drought situation. There can be a drought in terms of meteorology, while there is high flow. There is also sometimes there is a good rainfall for agriculture, but the flows would be low in terms of flowing into Sudan and Egypt. So this is a situation where you can see multiple dimensions of drought playing in the upper parts of catchment. That's why Ethiopia is mostly suspicious of in signing some of the agreements, as I show you later. Now, this is a World Bank publication in 2006 that shows Ethiopian economies directly linked to rainfall. As you can see, this is rainfall. And in most cases, when there is rainfall shortage, of course, this is the number of people that's getting aid. Even under circumstances where there is high rainfall, there is still many people under aid. What does it mean? It means that Ethiopia has exceeded its capacity to generate its food from rain-fed. So rain-fed agriculture in Ethiopia, because of many interacting challenges, especially degradation, land degradation, is exceeded. So there is always minimum of 5 million people under a safety net condition. As you know, the situation in 1984, where most of the drought was in the Nile part of area, in the Tigray, in the Wollo, in that part of area, if you know. So it is not only the flow condition, it's also the catchment drought conditions. That's one of the issues in Ethiopia. I'll go into some of the issues related to the challenge of, I don't see, I think, let me see. Yeah, I can see now. Conflict and elusive negotiation. Over the last 100, probably more than 100 years, because of the Nile, there was war, as you can see, in the 80s. And when Ethiopia was in internal conflict, Egypt built hard unilaterally. And of course, again, Ethiopia built its dam while NBI and other collaborative processes are going, Gird. So in this process, most of the dams and projects that's going on in the Nile Basin are unilateral. Whereas the drivers of water scarcity are booming in this region. As you can see, population is growing. Water knowledge curve is growing in the region, that people start asking, to develop their water resource. Economic growth is also growing. So, and also water uncertainty, climate change and different uncertainties are increasing. So while the drivers are increasing, water shortage is increasing, we can see this would be a very complex issue in the Nile Basin. So to show you population in the Eastern Nile in 1960, where the bilateral agreement was signed, was close to 56 million. Now the three countries' population is close to 265 million. It would have been easier to have a regional agreement in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s than now. The population is growing. So it adds additional layer of complexity as we delay agreements in the region. Therefore, I think this is very important that we should go in detail and focus on this. And now I'll go to Gird. Between 1990, it has been already alluded by many speakers. NBI, which was established as a transition mechanism in 1999, still exists, but a little bit weakened position. There was a cooperative attempt by World Bank and partners to build a joint multi-purpose project. There was an attempt for benefit sharing concept in, I think, 2008 to 2007. And there was a scoping study already done. I think Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia accepted that document. And of course, it failed. That cooperative attempt was one of a milestone for all of us, the countries, to jointly invest. And then the other was a cooperative framework agreement that was already discussed by many discussants. It also failed. So there was different cooperative attempts. There was different joint project attempts. Those attempts were not successful on those days. Then in the middle of this frustration by Ethiopia, it's not because of Egypt was in turmoil. It is the milestone to bring Gird was the failure of cooperative agreement. So once the cooperative agreement failed, Ethiopia decided they want, the population is growing, economy is growing. So they started Gird in 2011. So that brought parties, Egypt and Sudan, again to a negotiating table, which is a very good thing. What happened after that? So in a good phase, three countries cooperated. There was Ethiopia provided uncharacteristically in the region. There was non-cooperative instance in providing documents and sharing project documents in the Nile Basin. So Ethiopia provided all the documents for the three countries. And in 2014, I guess, the IPO was established to evaluate these documents, as Raya alluded, Rawia, sorry. And then National Technical Committee took up to follow up those documents. And then the milestone declaration of principles was signed by the three countries, which was a good thing. But most importantly, what I would like to show is the three countries established independent scientific community composed of 5 scientists, and they came up with almost a consensus document on the filling and operation of the Gird Dam. And that was a milestone for Ethiopia. They thought, I was also not part of it, but I was in Ethiopia at that time. I was not here. So that milestone was declined. That was a scientific achievement that moved Gird negotiation from technical driven process into a political. It might be good, it might, I cannot comment on that, but it moved the technical discussion into the political discussion. After that, as you know, there has been different negotiations, the attempt by World Bank and United States, as Mr. Weah also alluded. There were a lot of, up to now, where AU processes. And what are the sticking points? The sticking points, as far as I understand, I'm not a hydropolitical person, but one is a prolonged drought years, a compensation mechanism for a prolonged drought years is one of the sticking points. And the second point is legally binding issue. So what Ethiopia, as far as I'm concerned, is that if Ethiopia signs a prolonged drought years with a compensation mechanism that has a legally binding issue, Ethiopia fears that it can no longer develop its upstream catchments where recurrent drought and population pressure is there. So either that legal binding has to evolve in the future, or this prolonged drought is and compensation mechanism. These are the two issues that has to be solved as far as. So where are we now? We are in an uncharted territory in 2021, and Ethiopia is going to feel the second phase of Gird. So what I would, so what I can propose, what I can deduct from this is that this indicates Gird negotiation is not about Gird issue. I think it's beyond Gird issue. It's about positions of the country. It's also about interests of the country. So it has to probably go beyond the specific project negotiation, and it has to go also in a kind of progressive and adaptive negotiation. I have a few slides that I would like to show you how I perceive this negotiation should go. We know that almost the Gird filling is agreed by 3 countries. I think the 3 countries, as far as we hear, is agreed, and these countries, to build the trust, they should first agree before this filling starts on Gird filling. That will boost the next phase of negotiation, because the moment this filling is completed, it's not the completion of the Gird. The Gird has 3 to 5 years to be filled. So if these countries come together and agree on the terms that they have already agreed on the filling, then that would be one option, that they proceed to the next option of operation of the dam. That is, we have 3 to 4 years. So the next phase of negotiation, and then the next phase of cooperative framework or cooperation, another form of it could be agreement. So we have to go into a long-term, progressive long-term negotiation approach. This is one aspect. In terms of development aspect, I have drawn this funnel where it shows water utilization as well as water management aspects. We know in Sudan, in Egypt, a lot of water is being wasted through large number of open canals. And in Ethiopia, we have still degraded lands without significant irrigation. So what can these countries can do? If they establish cooperation, if they have water use and management monitoring system in place, then they have to go into a very long progress of negotiation. The first negotiation would be in filling, Gird filling, and how to go about the negotiation of development, because development in Ethiopia is as important as Sudan and Egypt. And then they can go into, this is the yellow part, is where there is a lot of water that can be unlocked from wastage. I read a document from Egypt, as much as 40% of water is wasted in Egypt. It is close to 30 to 40 billion of water. In Sudan also there. So if we can manage the lost water, and that lost water can be transferred into Ethiopia's probably small scale irrigation development or large scale irrigation development. So in this way, we can progressively unlock some of the wasted water. We can also unlock some of the water supply that's not being used, and then continue with Ethiopia's ambition also to develop its food resource. And then we can stop this is flat, and then countries can go together for a couple of 5 years, evaluate the development, and then continue with this approach of developing, and then progressively and evaluating and developing dynamically into up to 2050 or beyond. But
Dr. Semo, sorry, you are 1 minute behind. You are one minute over, please.
Okay. On all of this, I was a late comer, so can you give me a couple of 3-4 minutes? I tried to assemble quickly. So in all of this, I suggest without other instruments, as others alluded, economic cooperation should be very important. Countries should cooperate in a different, other than water. At some point, the economic cooperation must be more than the water itself. Then the water issue becomes a lower priority than economic issue. So countries should go, I think, in my view, in this way, and we have to treat the Nile as a shared resource without going into more of a nationalistic issue. I mean, we have to get out of the nostalgic national boundary approach of the Nile. We have to treat it as a borderless resource that's endowed to us all, and we have to share these resources together. Now, how do we get additional resource? We can have, Ethiopia has, this is the rainfall distribution in the Nile. 51% of the rainfall comes from both Sudan, and Uganda contributes about 13%, Ethiopia 20%. So there is some rainfall that can be salvaged from this. But this watershed restoration and enhancing productivity based on that would reduce some of the pressure of irrigation development in upstream countries. The second part is, we know also, I did some research, the aquifer systems that we have in Sudan and Egypt in fossilized water is very huge. So that part of the water should be also part of this equation, because population is growing. The Nile at some point might not be enough for all of these countries. So we have to bring this also equation. You can see the minimum recoverable. The minimum recoverable could be close to 14 to 15 billion amount of water that can add a little bit of water into the system. When you divide this into, let's say, if one takes 5 to billion per year from this water, it can at least take the countries until the population growth stabilizes. The population growth probably starts stabilizing from beyond 2050. So that part of water also can be added as part of the equation. And desalinization, Ethiopia is a landlocked country without additional water resource. This indicates, I have done some calculation, the desalinization water cost of desalination is becoming more and more cheaper than the freshwater resource as we go along. So that would in the future can also contribute to this the Nile saga. Finally, and most important, I would like to share you is that there are water, as I told you before, 85% of large irrigation in Sudan and Egypt are surface water, as surface canal based, and some studies.
Dr. Semo, you are 4 minutes above.
Okay, I'm finishing. So there are a lot of water that we can utilize from this by using a new agricultural technology that countries can introduce, such as smart agriculture. In this way, if we open up, one, our political space, second, that we can unlock jointly the available resources in the basin, then I think there is a lot of space to negotiate and cooperate in the region. I wanted to show you one slide, but I think it's overdue. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I know that it's not easy to stop someone who is enthusiastic about the topic and the issue. And of course, we are all interested in hearing more about it, but unfortunately, the time is not working in our interest always. So with this, I'd like to open the Q&A and leave the session to my colleague, Helen. Helen, would you like to take it from here?
Yes, I'll be glad to do that. We got a number of questions, but they seem to be concentrated on two people, Salman and Rawia. So I think it makes sense for me to try to consolidate three questions for Dr. Salman. And I think it would be useful, according to three members of the audience, if you'd say a little bit about water quality, both the problems and potential solutions. And in particular, we're talking about industrial runoff. We're talking also about soils and erosion. Would you like to respond to that, please?
Unmute, Salman.
Dr.
Unmute.
Salman? Yes, I've sent a request to ask him to unmute.
Dr. Salman, unmute yourself, please.
Perhaps we ought to go on, to the question for Dr. Walwi while we wait.
Dr. Salman, Helen, Dr. Salman is unmuted. Dr. Salman is unmuted now.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, the question about the water quality. As I said, I'm not really perhaps the right person to delve into this issue, but I can say generally that the conflict and the disputes on the Nile waters has been for a long time on the issue of quantity. Who gets how much and who gets when, how much and when. So the issue of quality hasn't really come in any agreement or any negotiations. But of course, there are major challenges to the use of the Nile waters, and we could see that in particular in Sudan, where sewage water is thrown into the Nile. We see the same problems in Egypt, and there are some talks about some of the fruits and vegetables being irrigated from water that's not really fit for consumption. So I don't think there is enough. I'm not suggesting that I don't know, but I don't think even for me there is enough writing about the issue of the quality of the Nile waters. It is definitely an issue, but it is overshadowed heavily by the issue of quantity.
Thank you.
And the distribution.
Thank you. I think I'll now turn to a question for Dr. Tawfik. A person has asked her, whether she can distinguish between optimum solution, where one party deems it an ideal, and optimum space, that is the creation of enabling conditions for agreement. And would not a binding agreement or an optimal solution for one infringe upon enabling conditions, which would be building trust and political will? Can we get an answer to that?
Sure. Thanks, Helen. I don't see a contradiction between seeking a binding agreement and enabling the environment through building trust and political will, because we're speaking here again about specific project that Ethiopia started not only unilaterally constructing but unilaterally filling, as Kevin mentioned last summer. And thus we're actually, I don't know about other cases, but I don't know about precedents where negotiations and construction and filling are taking place simultaneously. And we can imagine a situation where we have a non-binding agreement, i.e., go with the Ethiopian proposal, have some rules and guidelines that Ethiopia can then change or modify, and only according to the Ethiopian proposal, notify Sudan and Egypt. Would that be an agreement? What is the difference between having, some rules and guidelines that Ethiopia can change and having, no agreement at all? I cannot see a difference. And thus I cannot see, really a contradiction between having a binding agreement and building trust and political will. I think it's actually having binding agreement and respecting this agreement through implementation that will gradually lead to building trust. I think this is the main statement that I would like to make. But there are also a couple of other questions. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to respond to them now, but I'll be happy to do so now or later on.
And may I ask a follow-up question here? Perhaps a part of the reluctance here has to do with a difference, an asymmetry of power, and a concern that third-party involvement might really not be entirely impartial, but will respond to power differentials. You want to respond to that, please?
Sure. I think this was raised by Ethiopia during the US mediation, in particular during the Trump administration. And that was really, again, controversial because the US is an ally for both Ethiopia and Egypt. And thus there was no reason why one can assume some sort of, lack of neutrality here. But I think, on the other hand, Ethiopia actually accepted, the US to play this role, but then contested that this role shifted from being just an observer to some sort of conciliation or, intervention in, drafting the drafts and so on and so forth. But then let's look at the AU mediation effort, which has been in place for several months for now, and which is, again, suggested by Ethiopia to be somehow more neutral and is accepted by the three parties. I don't think that there has been any difference in positions if we compare the two cases, the US World Bank mediation and the AU mediation. And the reason is that, as I suggested, there seems to be no learning process, no adjustment of propositions and actions with the different rounds of negotiations in the last at least 5 years post-EOP.
Thank you. I'll turn back then to Dr. Salman.
Can I say something?
We have a question here about absolute sovereignty and whether or not either the notion of absolute sovereignty or absolute integrity and which has prevailed. Samuel, I see you have a comment. Would you like to begin with a comment and then I'll go on to the question? Go ahead.
It's a brief comment. What I understand Ethiopian position is any agreement that doesn't compromise the upstream utilization of the resources for different purposes, hydropower or irrigation, that kind of agreement is acceptable anytime, because Ethiopia is, I think, one of the only country that ratified in its water policy that transboundary water resource should be governed by equitable and reasonable utilization. And everything that projects those values and criteria is acceptable. I think that is a position of Ethiopia as far as I know. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Let's go then back to Dr. Solomon and this question about absolute sovereignty and equitable and reasonable utilization and the balance of those two ideas.
Is it possible to comment for a minute on the last question and answer, or shall I just go to this? I mean, that's your decision as the chair.
Excuse me, I don't understand your question.
I have a minor comment on the issue of the intervention by the U.S. and the World Bank.
I think you should go ahead and make your comment. Yes, of course.
Okay, I won't take long because I know we already. I think one problem, and I put that in the past to the negotiation. I think one problem, and I'm just commenting on what Dr. Rabia Tawfiq mentioned, is the role of the U.S. There were really questions. How could the USA and the World Bank, with all their leverage and all their convening power and the ability of bringing the three parties to Washington, how could they fail suddenly and fail completely? And I think that's a very relevant question, and I think a lot of people in the hydropolitics and the political science and law and negotiations raised. And I think that the major issue was there was no agreement on the role of the World Bank and the USA in that negotiation. Were they providing their good offices for the parties to sit down and bringing them coffee and urging them to reach a solution, or were they mediating by bringing some ideas and pushing the parties, or were they even going further, arbitrating between them? I think the main reason for the failure was the lack of agreement on what are the terms of reference for the USA and the World Bank. And so that was one reason, I think one major reason for the failure of the USA. This is coming to the parties now in the role of the OEU. Sudan is asking for more proactive role for the AU, and the negotiation is now concentrating in the major part on what role should the AU play? What should the parties agree to give the AU to play? And I think that's a major thing. Do they want to sit there and just help the parties to reach a negotiation, or will they intervene? And the question that comes next is, do they have the expertise and the knowledge of the problems and the expertise on the problem to really provide solution? And here I'm referring basically to the role of the World Bank in the Indus Waters Treaty, which Ariel can talk more about. And it was a major role because it wasn't really good offices, it wasn't mediation, it was much more than that, coming out with solutions, commenting on the solutions, and so on and so forth. So I think the major issue is now for the AU is agreeing with the parties on its role and making sure that it has the expertise to deliver that role. On the question about absolute sovereignty and absolute territorial sovereignty and absolute territorial integrity, those terms were used really a long time ago. When we talk about absolute sovereignty, this is something called the Hartung Doctrine. And Hartung was the Attorney General of the USA. There was a dispute with Mexico and the Rio Grande. And the question was, has the USA the right to do whatever it wants to do on the Rio Grande, or is it obliged to take into account the harm that could happen to Mexico? And the Attorney General, Mr. Hartung, came out with the opinion that yes, we can do whatever we want. We have absolute sovereignty in our land and in the water running in our land, and we don't have really to worry about what happens to any other riparian. And that's called the Hartung Doctrine, and it's called in legalese absolute territorial sovereignty. The opposite of this is the territorial integrity, which requires the country to allow the flow of the river to go uninterrupted or largely uninterrupted to the other riparians. And both are proven to be wrong and to be unworkable, because first, no country has the absolute of sovereignty, because this is a shared river and shared lake or shared river or shared aquifer. And the others on the other side, the country has the right to use the water in a reasonable manner. So what has happened through the years where those two principles were really got eroded and finally got totally rejected. And the current principles of international water law, as reflected in the UN Convention, before the UN Convention in customary international law and codified in the UN Convention, is equitable and reasonable utilization, which allows every riparian to have share in the river and share in the use of the river, provided that it does not cause significant adverse effect on the others. So you have the two theories much more refined and put in a logical context of equitable and reasonable utilization and the obligation not to cause significant harm to the other riparian. Because if one country is using a large quantity of water and the other country wants to use part of it, and it cannot be blocked because of the country is already using it, despite the fact that there may be harm to the other country. However, that harm should be significant, not just harm. And I have written an article, and it was an issue for major discussion and debate amongst the lawyers and the people interested in international water law and international waters, about harm being a two-way street. It's not only the upstream riparians that can harm downstream riparians. Downstream riparians can also harm upstream riparians. The title of the article is Downstream Riparians Can Also Harm Upstream Riparians, the Concept of Foreclosure of Future Uses. It is available, I think, from the library of the Hague Academy of International Law. They bought access to it, and it has been adopted by a number of authors recently in the commentary about the UN Convention that came from University of Geneva. I think I'll stop here, and if there's a follow-up, I can take it later.
Thank you. I think we need to change focus a little bit, and I have a question here for Semu Mogus. Are there agreements or future negotiations about sharing electricity in prolonged drought years?
Please again, I was distracted.
That's all right. We have a question asking about drought and whether or not there are agreements or discussions about sharing of electricity during periods of drought.
I think I have no knowledge of that, but it's part of this discussion. I don't have any knowledge if they have. I think my understanding of hydropower projects is that hydropower projects are non-consumptive projects that should not largely be controlled or dictated by downstream users. Therefore, if that happens, then I think agreements can be reached. Otherwise, if hydropower development is dictated by downstream use, the potential of selling hydropower would also become undermined. So it has to be dictated by that's. If that happens, then selling hydropower for Ethiopia, it will be easier than otherwise. That's what.
Thank you. Thank you. I have another question for Dr. Salman. Based on the history of negotiations, how do you foresee the situation? Is it a time now for Sudan to look for its own development projects in order to achieve economic and security and not be left behind? I think this is related to the whole question of different levels of development and the ability of downstream users to block that further development. And the question is, should there be a race now for development? And that might include what should be done here by other participants.
I hope there won't be a race, because as I kept saying in my presentation, the international water law and international waters are really the optimal use is through cooperation. And I have argued repeatedly during the last 10 years that the Gird should have been a jointly owned and managed project. It could have achieved a lot for Ethiopia, for Sudan, and for Egypt, not just for Ethiopia. It should have been jointly managed and operated. Unfortunately, it's too late now to talk about it. The question now is making sure that the Gird is benefits go beyond, go to the other countries, and that the other countries would really get convinced by the three countries, not the other countries, that by cooperation. The electricity production in Ethiopia is far cheaper than in hydropower. It's far cheaper than in Sudan and in Egypt. I read some reports which put it, maybe Kevin can add more to that. It's less than 25% than the cost of hydropower generation in Sudan and Egypt. And as I mentioned, most of the studies, including the Corps of Engineers study that was done in the 60s and was updated later in Ethiopia, put the hydropower potential in the Nile was more than 30,000 megawatt of electricity. And given the fact that Sudan really is about 60%, the coverage about 60 coverage of electricity is about 60%. There is an excellent opportunity that Sudan could get electricity from Ethiopia. Sudan has built the Merowe Dam. It turned out to be a major disputed dam because of the people that were affected and the resettlement process. And still there are cases before the court, and there is a lot of. So there are three projects, three dams. The Kajbar Dam on the main Nile, the three are on the main Nile. Kajbar Dam and Shirek Dam, and but there is a lot of opposition to those projects. And now that there is a democratic situation in Sudan, I think it will be impossible. I shouldn't say impossible, but be very difficult for Sudan to build
I know
those.
we're getting toward the end of our time.
So I think just to conclude, I think there is an excellent opportunity for Sudan to resolve a good part of its shortage of hydropower from the Gird and from other projects in Ethiopia, provided that it is done on a cooperative manner.
I may do a quick follow-up with that, if I could. I agree with Dr. Solomon. I think one of the big issues is we're already looking into a very strained basin in the future. Adding additional evaporation losses in Sudan is a risky endeavor, especially if the elevation differences are small. You end up having to have very large reservoirs to be able to generate electricity, or they end up being run-of-river reservoirs which don't generate electricity in a regular way. So it makes a lot more sense to purchase that electricity from Ethiopia than to build additional evaporation losses within Sudan.
That's a very useful exchange. I need to follow up with a physical question, the question of sedimentation. Numbers of people have asked specifically, I think perhaps prompted by Ariel Dinar's picture of the sedimentation downstream. What is the sediment situation and how might it be affected by this project? Dr. Solomon? Iman?
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I think there is also another question related to perhaps Kevin can address it, because I saw him address this in the answered box, related to the impact of climate change on the flow of the Nile and how this.
Yes, let's address that.
Certainly, yeah. So the climate science has been very mixed for a long time on the Nile, where a lot of climate projections said drier, some said wetter, so it was very inconclusive. Some of the best work that's come out recently, which I think I put in the chat from Simon El-Taher in MIT, indicating an increasing variability and some evidence of increasing rainfall, as I showed in some of my graphs as well, runoff. So while there's not a clear indication, we are getting some indication of increased variability, and also a very strong link with the Indian Ocean dipole. So the same event that's causing the large fires in Australia, causing very large flooding in Ethiopia and coming into Sudan. So as we understand that increasing in frequency, we understand that those teleconnections are also very strong. So yeah, we're getting some, and then also there's aridification in the hotter areas as well. So the areas in Egypt and Sudan becoming more difficult in some ways for irrigation just for increasing temperatures.
Kevin, do you want to deal with this sedimentation question? Is that something that you can address, or do we need to refer back to Dr. Salman? Or
can you repeat it again for me real quick?
A question about sedimentation and what kind of problem it is, and how is it being considered?
Okay. Well, sedimentation is a two-way street. The Ethiopian dam will trap a lot of the sediment coming out of the Blue Nile. However, there's still a lot of sediment that comes in from the tributaries downstream. There will be very significant benefits to the sediment reduction for Sudan. Currently, their reservoirs, they struggle a lot maintaining their reservoirs due to the sediment accumulation. And they have to clean out their canals very, very frequently as they spend a lot of money on cleaning out their canals. So the Gird will help a lot reduce the sediment. And then there's also the other side of sediment losses, how that inhibits the transportation of nutrients. But really that applies in Sudan. We have to think Egypt is already dammed. It's a completely unnatural flow going into Egypt, and there's no sediment going into Egypt now anyway. So there will be no implications sediment-wise from Ethiopia or from the dam into Egypt, but it will change and clean the water essentially, or clear the water out in Sudan. So there's a lot of talk about loss of sediment in terms of floodplain irrigation, the brick making, those types of things, but it'll be probably generally a beneficial thing for Sudan to have less sediment flowing in that river. It'll do a lot of geomorphic changes in terms of incising the rivers more and that type of thing. But yeah. But
I think that's very helpful. I want to check with Ayman about our time. Where are we? We have additional time here. Ayman?
Unfortunately, Helen, we are almost like 30 minutes above the schedule, and
that's what I thought. And I wanted just to quit at a time when it all seemed rather balanced. And I want to thank everyone. I didn't get to all the questions. I did try to collapse some questions, but I think we had a very useful discussion. And I'd like to thank all the participants. Sarush, have you some closing remarks?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, Ayman and Helen, for moderating this wonderful third and last for this cycle of the Rosenberg Forums. And I'd really like to thank Salman, Ariel, Kevin, Rabia, and Samu for willingness to participate and contribute to this. Yeah, these are some challenging questions, many uncertainties, climatically and otherwise. And of course, the politics is a separate issue by itself, but certainly some wisdom was added to this workshop on our call today. And I hope that in a future time, we will have an opportunity to revisit this whole question, see how much progress has been made. Again, thank you. Thank you, Sherry, and your staff for a really wonderful job of putting these webinars together professionally and nicely. And with that, I wish everybody a wonderful evening, afternoon, or morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.